to give you perfect. I would like to give you more information than you actually need. So the PDF of these slides has been shared and will go out to attendees. So there's a lot of slides and we're just going to get through all of them. And there are guidelines. There's lots of resources coming your way. And if you have questions, I am here for you. Okay. My disclosures is that I'm the founder and owner of Nutrition and Recovery, which is a group practice here in West LA. I don't have any financial conflicts of interest to report. However, I will state that I'm biased. I do believe that nutrition for mental health is the future, and this is the lens by which I see nutrition. I do have a new blog and new business called Wise Mind Nutrition, which is really expanding beyond just addictions and eating disorders into the broader domain of mental health, depression, anxiety, etc. I don't have any particular way of eating that I'm here to promote. I don't have any agendas. I'm not trying to persuade anyone to change the way that they eat or to think about food like I think about food. I'm here to just provide some evidence and to talk broadly about the movement that we call nutrition in recovery. The obligatory background slide just reminds us that we have a crisis right now, and that substance use disorder is severe, chronic, and relapsing, and we have an urgent need for new approaches. And this might include things like nutrition intervention. We know that the programs with the most reluctance to change are often the ones that would benefit the most. So there's a need in the field for champions. So this could be facilities that want to be champions for change and take the lead in integrating new modalities for treatment. And then, I've done a lot of work at centers, bringing wellness to the campus. And what we have found is that when we can get staff members and people on the team to become champions for change, the work is much better carried out. So I am an academic as well as a clinician. So I'm going to share a lot of the work that I've done and some of the work that we've published. I think one of my first efforts came in 2014. There was a textbook by Dr. Brewerton and Dr. Amy Baker Dennis. And it was an effort to integrate knowledge around eating disorders and substance use disorders. And so I contributed a chapter called Nutrition Therapy for eating disorders, substance use disorders, and addictions. And it was an early effort to really merge some of these differing schools of thought and try to help establish some guidelines for people that are looking to implement this type of care. One of the resources we're sharing with you all today is from this book chapter, which came in 2019. I actually wrote it in 2017. It was a summary of all the published literature up till 2017 about nutrition deficiencies, as well as consideration of eating behavior, disordered eating. And we published guidelines for individual substances. And I just want to state that, there are studies that show differences between heroin and meth and alcohol, et cetera. But I think that it's wise to consider that, most people use polysubstances. There's so many other contextual factors that contribute. So, thinking about it just as simple as what substance does someone use and what's the nutrition intervention, I think is very narrow, and we always need to think a little bit broader. But this is just like an overall recommendation sheet when we think about all of them together. And, if we were to look at this, like, I think there's a lot of dietitians here on the webinar. We're looking at okay, drinking more water, more beans, nuts, and seeds, more whole grains, anti-inflammatory food, more fiber, right? Like, none of it's shocking, right? None of it's really shocking. We're talking about, eating regularly, anti-inflammatory food, more plants, Mediterranean style eating. And so I just want to state that the real gap in this area is not knowledge about what does, recovery oriented eating look like. It really is implementation science, right? How do you actually translate this stuff to where people are excited about eating. The culinary staff is on board. So one of the next efforts we made was, what about running groups? Okay, so if we're going to change the food service environment, how can we bring nutrition education and get people to be excited about some of the changes? It's been my experience that when you change the food at a facility, but don't teach the staff or the clients about it, you can run into problems, and they can actually become clinical problems, right? So the next kind of phase was, what groups can we run in these settings, and how can we match the curriculum with the changes that are being made on the menu? Okay, and how do you get people to be champions for change? How do you get people to be excited? So you can see some of the group topics here. The next piece of work we did was looking at how how prevalent is nutrition education. And this was from Los Angeles. We were able to use the SAMHSA treatment locator to identify facilities that were able to respond to our questionnaire. Okay, we did a rapid assessment, which when we called people, and of the 128 facilities in Los Angeles, less than a third offered any nutrition services. And of those, less than a quarter actually used registered dietitians. So in total, less than 7% of all substance use treatment centers in Los Angeles in our sample utilized registered dietitians. Okay, so there's a need, I guess we can call it, in public health, we call it a missed opportunity. My PhD is in public health from UCLA in the community health science department. I have a minor in health psychology, and my doctoral dissertation was not on nutrition at all. So I just want to put that out there for anyone that's an RDN or looking to consider career stuff. There are ways to bring in work from different disciplines and to merge it all. And I think that's an important thing that we need more of. So this is an example of an effort to merge different disciplines. I've really wanted to talk about gut health amidst the opioid crises. There wasn't quite enough evidence. So I built a conceptual model to think about the bigger picture here. I lumped the substances, alcohol, drugs, caffeine, nicotine, food, and drinks, because they all have potential for reward, some of which isn't always dysfunctional. Reward can be associated with well-being, but in other cases, it can create an addictive cycle where we have negative affect, preoccupation, craving, withdrawal, and it repeats the cycle. And then once we look at what's driving substance consumption, we think about neurobiological pathways, which can be influenced by genetics. And then we start to go further upstream and think about how intergenerational and generational legacies can play a role, how the role of trauma, stress, adversity, especially in the first 18 years, can impact reward, which we'll talk about today. And then that's all situated in the larger context of socioeconomic status, the environment in which people live. And then we've identified some mediators such as epigenetic changes in the gut microbiota, et cetera. So yeah, this is stuff we do in academia, stay up real late and build conceptual models and try to talk about them. Fun stuff. Our next efforts, we did a presentation at the International Society of Nutritional Psychiatry Research. This was in 2019. We shared about our efforts to move toward nutrition standards in substance and alcohol use disorder treatment. And then I got involved in work here in Los Angeles as part of my training at UCLA, where we looked at a cohort. There's a longitudinal cohort of low income, mostly Black and Latino men who have sex with men. And I got involved in this research group, and we were able to look at food insecurity as a mediator between drug use and depressive symptoms. So the findings from this research suggested that food insecurity can explain approximately 15% of the association between drug use and depressive symptoms. So it starts to consider the question, what happens when individuals spend their money on drugs instead of food? It doesn't actually answer that question, but it starts to pose new future research questions, and can chronic malnourishment lead to depression? Next, I did some work in Santa Cruz at a place called Janus. I was very fortunate to be a part of their grant, and we wanted to change their entire food service operation and build some wellness programs. And I took several trips up there from Los Angeles. This is just a logic model. I'm not going to read it all. I've highlighted a few things that I'll touch on. Some of the activities were to develop nutrition guidelines, to put some of those guidelines in place, be able to communicate them, help the staffs and the clients understand the relationship between nutrition and mental health, create shifts in client staff beliefs, okay? And then obviously with the goal of improving long-term quality of life. So when we changed the food and implemented a wellness initiative, we collected data from the staff to see where they identified barriers so that we could increase the likelihood of this going well for other investigators. And you can see here that several barriers were perceived as easier or less, I should say, after the intervention, like correcting nutritional deficiencies, implementing nutritional change during detox, monitoring dietary supplements, budgeting, implementing new foods, and more healthful items. So I think the people that attended some of the seminars and the trainings were able to really see that, you know, investing time and money in nutrition is not a waste of resources. In fact, it's actually a really wise way to create better outcomes. Okay. We don't have good data showing improved outcomes at this time. I've given this a lot of thought. You know, it's like, what are the outcomes of interest, right? Is it sobriety time? Probably not. We're thinking about things more like, you know, depressive symptoms, anxiety symptoms, et cetera. So yes, staff perceived barriers can decrease. We know that novel nutrition interventions can be done. We can improve food service and teach nutrition education and cooking classes in these settings. So I just want to touch on this because I'm going to come back to it later. I'm going to talk about eating disorders later, but I just really want to highlight this paper, weight-related concerns related to drug use. You could see in this study of nearly 300 people, almost half were concerned that gaining weight could trigger relapse. A lot of people started using drugs to lose weight, and we're looking at methods, things like diet pills, smoking, et cetera. So there's just a lot of things to think about, okay? We know that the relationship between eating disorders and substance use disorders is bidirectional. And I've spent a lot of time trying to disentangle the temporal sequence, which one comes first, et cetera. There's significant overlap neurochemically and behaviorally, a lot of behaviors and difficulties with emotion regulation, coping with negative affect, et cetera. So, you know, there's been tremendous effort to understand their co-occurrence. There hasn't been a lot of consensus on how to best treat when these things cluster and co-occur. The comorbidity ranges between 3 and 50%. I've seen estimates of being even higher, but more likely there's a lot of subclinical disordered eating, things like night eating, dieting behavior, body image issues, et cetera. So this is a little shift. I want to take you through the evolution of nutrition frameworks. I'm going to offer you 8 frameworks that have been used in the nutrition space with the goal of hoping you see how we're moving or evolving into a new paradigm. I want to point out that nutrition research is difficult. You know, a lot of the impacts of nutrition is generally slow, so it takes a long time to follow people. There's lots of mixed findings in nutritional epidemiology, and there's a wide range of different things that can work for people. And since everyone eats, most people have opinions. And I think one of my biggest, you know, bones to pick with our field, and I've been saying this stuff from the rooftop, is that, you know, we see the formation of groups based on nutritional identity or other identities that are forming in society. And, you know, I just want to caution people to be wary of this. You know, there's a phenomenon called groupthink, and you maybe have heard the term toxic tribalism, when people find their campsite and say, this is how I see the world in this arena. And we're going to be very mindful to make sure people that aren't like us aren't welcome here. Okay. And that is absolutely going on in the nutrition space. The first model is the calorie model, the most established framework. Most people know what a calorie is. We've got this law of thermodynamics. which suggests that energy cannot be created or destroyed. So we got this concept of energy balance. And this is where all the math-centric nutrition approaches come. Anyone who follows me knows that I'm not for math-centric approaches to nutrition, although I know in facilities and hospitals, there's a need for quantifiable, measurable things. But a lot of people associate nutrition with calories and use apps that have this data. There's a lot of focus on weight management and sports nutrition. And I've made the argument that the calorie model is very much incomplete and can even be misleading. The next model is the macronutrient model, which goes one step further and looks at carbohydrates, protein, and fat and how these are distributed, thinks about manipulating these variables. And common examples are things like, low carb, high fat. Everyone knows trending things like the keto diet, right? Very popular in fitness circles and in those focusing on altering body composition, focusing on grams of protein. A major shortcoming is that it assumes all food within a macro category are equal, that carbs are carbs and fat is fat, et cetera. The next model is the micronutrient model, where it looks at how vitamins and minerals present in food. These are important for a wide range of processes. Many of the apps also estimate these. The shortcoming with this model is that it tends to create a shift toward emphasis on supplements rather than food. I think a lot of people assume if they can get their micronutrients in supplemental form, they can make food choices based on calories, macros, or based on preference, right? And I'd like to point out that micronutrients and supplements don't compare to those in food. And this is due to food synergy, which I'll talk about more later. And then there's the food group model. Everyone knows this stuff. Once it was the pyramid, now it's a plate. I think that there's some things that are easy to understand. For example, suggesting people eat half of their plate in fruits or vegetables, eating from all the different food groups. It does assume that foods in each category are nutritionally similar. But the problem with this model is that people often use it to look for what to cut out, right? I'm going to cut out this food group or cut out this food group. I like food group systems in general because they're not always math centric and they have easy applications. And then we're moving into some of these newer frameworks, the anti-inflammatory model, where we look at population level data to think about what foods can be the most inflammatory. The DII was, I think, published starting around 2004, and there's been a lot of research on it that look at population level data. However, we know that population level data doesn't always apply to individuals. A person can be highly reactive to foods that are considered anti-inflammatory at the population level. So I put a little question mark by functional lab testing. These are things that I do. There are some tests that can be very, very helpful. But of course, there are some shortcomings with that approach as well. And then we've got the gut health model. It's related to anti-inflammatory eating. We've got a ton of research on, microbiome through stool testing that starts to point to the use of probiotics and prebiotics. And now we're looking at postbiotics, which are the byproducts of bacterial degradation. Things like short chain fatty acids that can be converted into other compounds in the body. Big fan of the gut health model because it challenges the calorie model, right? When people see nutrition through the lens of calories, you can overlook a lot of the importance of things related to gut health. And when you're really looking more at gut health, it doesn't really track necessarily with the calorie model, okay? So I just want to point out, and we'll come back to the frameworks, a little sidetrack, that there's a lot of pathways between the gut and the brain. I'm not going to get into all of them. I'm going to touch on all of them very briefly today, but they're all nutrition related. Okay. So I think that, the future of nutrition for mental health involves an understanding of all of these different pathways and how nutrition and food can be a part of it. I've always liked this image because it's pretty straightforward. Just tells us, the symbiotic relationship that we want includes a rich and diverse microbiota where there's redox balance, the immune is working well, mucosal barrier is intact. People tend to make a transition toward increase in permeability, reduction in diversity, oxidative stress, and inflammatory processes. And then many people end up here where there's a lot of, permeability and inflammation, et cetera. And I've always made the argument that there's probably a lot more people living here than are aware of, right? So if you think about like what a nutrition intervention could do, if someone comes to treatment, right, and they're over here, like how do we just get them over here, right? Forget about calories and macros. Like how do we get someone to where their immune system isn't going nuts, okay? So there's been some data on gut health and substance use disorders. This was one example. There's actually several, that changes in the microbiota are associated with substance use. Mostly studies that look at drugs show a reduction in bacterial diversity. I just want to point out that, in some studies, there were certain, species that were significantly higher, okay? So when species tend to reduce, other species tend to proliferate, okay? And this is what we know as gut dysbiosis. There were some early animal studies showing that with opioids in certain animal models, you get bacterial translocation, which, can cause a lot of inflammation, as well as some strains can actually really become prevalent. Okay. So yes, we're looking at a loss of diversity, but there are cases when some strains can actually overgrow. Okay. And there's a lot of research questions like, is it possible that some of these strains could be involved in the craving cascade? And some work at UCLA showed that the gut microbiota mediates reward and sensory responses. So there's a lot of potential understanding for the role in gut bacteria and addictions. And this just gives you a snapshot of changes in, microbiome composition with alcohol. You could see, one could look at this and say it's not a huge change. Alcohol consumers have this profile on average, and controls have this. We certainly need to know more, but I just wanted to point out that this is a major an important area that we need more data on. There's some incredible work from Ireland. Dinnan and Cryan are some of my favorite researchers that have really investigated how microbes can metabolize drugs and how drugs can modify gut microbiota. Okay, so welcome to the future of behavioral health, where we're thinking not only about drugs and alcohol, caffeine, nicotine, and then how all the different foods and possibly even supplements affect the gut microbiota composition. Of all the things that do alter intestinal integrity, I think food is obviously a big one, okay? So Western style diets, and I'm a food positive dietitian, very mindful not to identify, point fingers at food. If there's one thing that I consistently point the finger at, it's artificial sweeteners. Not a fan, try to get people off of them. But here we're starting to see where Western style diets can really compromise in the intestinal barrier. And then I've been really interested in this concept of leaky brain. We know that inflammation can lead to pro-inflammatory cytokines, which can in turn increase the blood-brain barrier permeability. And this is the concept of neuroinflammation, which is receiving a lot of attention, okay? So we've got a lot of pathways between the gut and the brain, a lot of mediators, immune, nervous, vascular system. And I think that, dietitians need to get on board with understanding these various pathways so that we can use food to improve mood and brain health. Yes, that's what we're here to talk about. I used to, really message nutrition and recovery, like how does, nutrition improve addiction? Okay. And we'll talk a little bit about that, but I think it's wiser to start thinking about, because, substance use disorders cluster and co-occur with other mental health disorders like depression and anxiety. How can we use nutrition to improve depressive and anxiety symptoms? Okay. So these are just some references for you about the role of probiotics in reducing stress, anxiety, and depression. Some of these are actual clinical trials. Some of them are systematic reviews. So there's data, okay? And I think collectively what I'll say is that the evidence supporting probiotics for depressive symptoms seems to be the strongest, although there's definitely support for anxiety. We're not at a place where we can say we got to use this strain or this product. I think we're still so far from that because everyone is truly, truly different, okay? The next framework is called personalized nutrition. Maybe you've heard the term precision medicine or precision nutrition. It draws from all these previous approaches. So it starts to build into a more individualized approach where we can look at genetics, which indicate vulnerabilities, not conditions, but vulnerabilities, We can look at blood, saliva, stool, looking at glucose markers, food sensitivity, micronutrient insufficiencies, as we talked about, gut, hormones, etc. One of the shortcomings is that it's often not covered by insurance. A lot of these tests are expensive, and there are a lot of people misusing and abusing this approach for financial gain, doing a lot more testing and selling a lot more supplements. And that's just my opinion. I do practice this stuff, but I'm very mindful. Another shortcoming is that personalized nutrition hasn't fully integrated. It's based on these biological parameters and hasn't fully integrated the importance of mental health, or what we can also call someone's psychiatric profile. And that is the work that I'm doing now. How do we personalize nutrition based on someone's psychological makeup rather than just their blood markers? And that's what we're doing at Wise Mind Nutrition. Okay, so in the next framework, mental health, we've got the burgeoning field of nutritional psychiatry, where we look at some of the biomarkers of neuroinflammation and looking at the role of micronutrients in mental health recovery. But we've also got this field of nutritional psychology. And I do a lot of work here because I'm often talking to people, not just about, what they're eating, but how they're thinking about what they're eating, right? The experience living in their body. All right. And this challenges the calorie model. Again, the calorie model might say an artificial sweetener is a good choice. A mental health model might say, no, raw honey is a much better choice. Right. So the work that I do is biopsychosocial, and we start to think about how we can integrate both the biology and the psychology, all situated within social context. Okay. So if we were to look at nutrition and recovery and apply the macronutrient model, we might say that there are people that benefit from higher protein. There are approaches that use like high dose amino acid therapies. I've never been convinced of that. I'm not saying anything negative about it, but I tend to think that using food and trying to get higher protein is a more long-term sustainable approach. And I'm into things that are long-term and sustainable. Okay, that's a bias that I have. In that model, we might also think about the types of fats that one would be consuming, emphasizing omega-3. If we were to look at the micronutrient model, yes, nutrient-rich diet, but there are, of course, supplements that can help, things like multi-B complex, vitamin D, magnesium, omega-3 probiotics, others like rhodiola or ashwagandha. And some of you are experts here. If we were to use the food group model, there's some application trying to get all 6 food groups every day. In the nutrition and recovery system, I have a 6 food group for beans, nuts, and seeds. I think that it's important to emphasize them. And in the anti-inflammatory model, we think about anti-inflammatory foods. Of course, acknowledging that a lot of fun foods that are delicious can be pro-inflammatory. Rather than focusing on what to avoid, we tend to teach people what to include, right? So keeping it food positive. And here's a list if anyone's interested in looking for some of the best anti-inflammatory foods based on the Dietary Inflammatory Index. So if we were to apply the gut health model, I would say that this is it. This is like what I've been focusing on in terms of nutrition interventions, nutrition education, things like, probiotics, fermented foods, yogurt, kefir, more soluble fiber, perhaps other things that are known to be helpful with gut, lots of colorful foods, and of course, patience, right? So people come in for nutrition intervention and care, and instead of getting taught calories and macros, they get taught about the gut-brain axis. And now they're thinking about food differently. And this is highly, highly effective. Using the personalized nutrition framework, I would say if people can afford testing, go for it. The key is to keep learning about yourself and learn more as you make changes, retest, etc. This nutrition for mental health lens is new. I just want to encourage people to set aside everything you think you know and be open to this burgeoning field. When we think about the psychology of eating behavior, we think about hedonic eating or reward-based eating, certainly cross-addiction, and the role of restrained eating as well. Okay, so big area of study is the link between depression and diet. Okay, we know it's bidirectional. So we know that highly palatable foods can alleviate negative affect, and we know that low quality diets can increase depressive symptoms. We also have longitudinal data to show that over time, people that consume more ultra processed food have a higher risk of developing depression. Okay. And, this is important. It's like a perfect example of being mindful. I think when it comes to toxic tribalism, nutrition for mental health is a very like alternative middle, right? You have extremes over here of all foods fit, and then you've got like real diety stuff over here, weight loss and things of that nature. Nutrition for mental health is like pulling from, I think this is my opinion, pulling from these different areas and like, okay, we keep it food positive. We're against weight stigma, but we also acknowledge that certain foods affect mental health poorly. Okay. And so the challenge becomes, how do we message this? How do we create messaging around this that's not going to increase any risk for dieting behavior, but also acknowledge that what you eat matters, okay? And that all calories aren't created equal, okay? And so this is the efforts, right, to try to merge eating disorder philosophy with nutritional psychiatry and find the sweet spot where people can actually make some changes that make a measurable difference in their mental health. Related to the research, we know that dietary interventions can significantly reduce depressive symptoms. However, at this time, no effect has been observed for anxiety. So if someone has depressive symptoms, guess what? Like the quality of the food matters, okay? And so it's important to think about this bigger picture. The Mediterranean lifestyle is, the most evidence-based approach to a lot of nutrition related outcomes. Okay. I don't like the word diet, so I don't call it a diet. Sometimes I'll, use the Mediterranean diet language, but it's a way of life. Okay. It's enjoyed in parts of the world like Spain, Italy, Greece, France, and others. And this just gives you a little snapshot of some of the common foods. Most of you are probably aware, things like olives, olive oils, avocados, avocado oil. Okay. Big emphasis on fish and seafood, which contribute omega-3s. And then per Nutrition and Recovery's approach, a lot of emphasis on beans, nuts, and seeds. I'm just a beans, nuts, and seeds kind of guy, and I'm teaching beans, nuts, and seeds a lot. Okay. And this is part of the Mediterranean lifestyle. We know that whole grains have a lot of benefits. You could see here, decreased risk for a wide range of these sort of more biomedical outcomes. And the mechanism, as you might guess, is through the gut microbiome. Okay, so whole grains have higher fibers and are, fuel for bacteria that live inside of us, which in turn improve our immune system. So a bigger portion of what I'm doing in the context of messaging for nutrition for mental health is talking about fiber. Okay. And a lot of people that come into recovery from alcohol and drugs have had a chronic low fiber diet. So we're looking at how we can increase fiber gradually over time, trying to get people to really get, closer to 30, 40 grams of fiber per day. And so this is a big part of what we're doing often in these settings, trying to get people to get fiber from food, not from supplements. So things like fruits, vegetables, whole grains, beans, nuts, and seeds, eating a wide range of plant foods on a regular basis, getting a fruit or vegetable with every meal or snack. I think in the fiber conversation, it's super important to also talk about polyphenols, because a lot of good data show that the bacteria inside of us also thrive on these compounds. Many of you might know that these are stable 6-carbon benzene rings that can donate electrons, hence the term antioxidant. Okay. So these are just some examples of polyphenols. You probably heard the term flavonoids. You might have heard of things like quercetin that you could find in apple or apple skins, or resveratrol, which is in grapes. It's just important to acknowledge that a lot of foods have high polyphenolic content, and these are actually very, very helpful for our aims. And a lot of herbs and spices are really rich in polyphenols. So yes, we need not just fiber, but fiber and polyphenols, which points to the use of quote unquote real food. Okay. There's a synergy between the two that help improve gut health. Okay. So yeah, the colors in foods tell a story. This is the next frontier in prebiotics. Okay. And so yes, this part of the message is also important. And here's some examples of foods that are high in polyphenols. If you were to look here at the vegetables, you see red lettuce, red onion, just wanting to highlight that the colors matter, okay? The colors in food matter. And then I spent a lot of time in the last year, year and a half messaging around the use of herbs and spices in an effort to get people to cook more of their own food. And if anyone wants recipes at Wise Mind Nutrition, on one of our blogs, we have downloadable recipes that are sorted by herb and spice. Okay. So if anyone's looking for some fun stuff to play with, there are resources there for you. All right, we're going to switch lanes a little bit. Okay. This is a talk that like I've given a lot. This is an updated and condensed version. I think the conversation around trauma is critical for the conversation around addictions as well as eating disorders. This is all based on a life course perspective. This is the work that I did as part of my doctorate, to start thinking more broadly about health, thinking about multiple pathways toward negative health outcomes, as well as advantageous or protective factors. Okay, so it looks at how these things can accumulate, as well as in the context of generational change. Early life adversity includes various stressors, traumas, and forms of deprivation in the first 18 years. It could be in utero. We're going to talk about ACEs and expanded ACEs. It could also include things like poor nutrition, toxins, lack of cognitively stimulating experiences. We know that early life adversity is strongly correlated with social and environmental factors. However, they occur across all levels of socioeconomic status. And with respect to mental health, it has been suggested that time does not heal all wounds. Some people are more resilient than others, right? And so what are the factors that lead to resilience? Are there genetic factors? Are there factors rooted in social support, access to resources, et cetera? And I really like this diagram. It just, really summarizes efforts to understand how early life adversity changes the brain. Okay. This is separating early life adversity into threat and deprivation, different dimensions of adversity. We know that it can affect emotions, right? Things like in the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, the dopamine system. And we'll touch on some of these all very briefly. There's a lot of psychological changes, and they all lead to addiction-like behaviors, including highly palatable food. I speak a lot with dietitians, and I know that there's pushback on the concept of food addiction, and I am here to welcome any pushback, happy to have discussions. It's just about science. We're just talking about science, okay? And so I'm going to share some of that data. We know that early life stress activates the immune system early on with the production of macrophages and monocytes, oftentimes produced in the bone marrow, and these can increase cytokine production, leading to low-grade peripheral inflammation, which we know can cross the blood-brain barrier. Okay, so this is the link between trauma and mental health from one perspective. Okay, there are certainly others. We know that once inflammation gets in the brain, it can increase the likelihood of engaging in risky behaviors. Okay, so this is the neuroimmune network hypothesis as part of the growing field of psychoneuroimmunology. The microglia are glial cells located throughout the brain and spinal cord. We know that impaired microglial function can confer risk for vulnerability to addiction. So this is just highlighted here because it's a hot topic. All right. This is definitely slides that I could have left out, but I just couldn't do it. I just couldn't leave it out. I wanted you guys to have some of these slides. I'm just going to go through it quickly. What I've done here is highlighted how alcohol can lead to anxiety, depression, and craving, essentially leading back to relapse, and how early life adversity is an antecedent oftentimes to alcohol use, and that early life adversity or early life trauma actually can affect the gut and create higher likelihood of intestinal permeability. And so when there's trauma and alcohol combined, it makes it more difficult to achieve what some people might call recovery. Okay, so with alcohol in the picture and trauma in the picture, we have more gut-derived immune activation leading to inflammation in the liver, specifically for alcohol. Okay, We're getting peripheral inflammation. We know that can cross the blood-brain barrier. We know that that can create neuroinflammation, potentially in the amygdala, all of which can increase the likelihood of anxiety, depression, cravings, which then essentially leads to relapse. Okay, so this is here for you. I do have a reference list if anyone wants to get into the mechanisms. I'm happy to provide that for you. I also have another video on this topic that I'm happy to share if anyone wants to take a deeper dive here. A more simplified way to think about this is, just through poor health behaviors, oxidative stress, increased impulsivity, increased addiction, and then back to the craving cascade. Okay, so ACEs, a big part of the work that I've done in the last few years, generally broken into categories of childhood maltreatment, which includes abuse and neglect, and then household dysfunction. So these are generally measured in the household, answered in a yes/no format. And then in more recent years, we have the concept of expanded ACEs or other adversity, things like bullying or even experiencing discrimination in the neighborhood, violence, etc. Okay, so some ACE tools are household only and some are more expanded. As a public health researcher, I'm a big fan of expanded ACEs. And this is important because, when we think about these social conditions that lead to ACEs, how it can disrupt neurodevelopment, impair health across a lot of domains that lead to risky behaviors and essentially disease, disability, social problems, and early death. Early on in the late 90s, the original ACE study showed that having 4 or more ACEs compared to those who had none, increased the likelihood of using alcohol and hard drugs by 5 to 10-fold. This sample was not representative. It was mostly white and insured patients in Southern California, but needless to say, this put the link between trauma and addictions on the map. And then more recently, we've really looked at how childhood adversity can become biologically embedded. When I've given these talks in the recent year or two, I've put a lot of focus on these pathways, and I'm just not going to do that today because of the time. But I just want to highlight and give you this as a roadmap. I believe this paper to be open access, that a lot of resulting biological changes from trauma can include epigenetic changes, specifically DNA methylation, particularly in the glucocorticoid system, changes in the brain, okay, functional connectivity, changes in the dopamine system, changes in the HPA axis, and then a lot of literature describing changes in inflammation and potential gut-based inflammation, okay? And this is one other paper that really walks us through the link between ACEs and addiction, highlighting 3 pathways. One is the altered dopamine receptor expression and production, altered brain reward, which we'll touch on, leading to sensation or novelty seeking and other forms of risk-taking behaviors. There's also a pathway through oxytocin, which I really have become interested in and planning to do some work on. And then, as I mentioned, this glucocorticoid receptor, okay, which is linked to the HPA axis. So lots of good data here, and I'm not going to spend too much time covering it, but I do want to say that childhood adversity always needs to be looked at in social context, things like urban versus rural, the experience of minoritized status, all of which are forms of stressors that can change the brain, okay? And what we're seeing is that people process rewards differently. Salience describes the assignment of values. It kind of captures how memorable something is by the brain. So when someone has been exposed to a lot of stress and then they develop patterns that reduce negative affect, the brain's going to learn that behavior, okay? And so it's going to be able to recreate that behavior, whether it be drugs, food, restriction, etc. A lot of people don't like the brain disease model of addiction and would rather consider some of the underlying causes like anxiety, depression, social isolation, neighborhood characteristics, looking at the role of socioeconomic status, structural racism, the causes of the causes, looking at how social factors can essentially get under the skin. And in public health, we call these the social determinants of health. So quick pivot here. I'm going to talk about food addiction a little bit. I think it has like a pretty bad rep in some circles. I'm an eating disorder dietitian, and I know that in that circle, it's not well received. I think because in the classic eating disorder world, it's very much more positive and inclusive and non-shaming and about moderation. And I think if you look on social media at a lot of people talking about food addiction, it's really just a dressed up way of trying to approach weight loss. Okay. And I see that, and I want to acknowledge that. But I also want to say that there's a lot of researchers who are not biased by our own personal experience that are looking at food addiction, not necessarily as a, relic of diet culture or food shaming, but really as just another construct that can help add to our understanding of eating behavior, both in the context of eating disorders and without. Okay, so enough with the black and white thinking, please. The Yale Food Addiction Scale came out now, almost 15 years ago, using DSM criteria for dependence. Now YFAST 2.0 using substance use disorder. Okay, this recently was published. It just shows you how many times this term has been used. Okay, so I just want to put some context for any food addiction haters. This term has been used in over 2,500 peer-reviewed publications. Okay, so this is a great area of scientific inquiry worldwide. And the prevalence of food addiction in that paper was nearly 20%. Okay, and so this was a recent paper I wrote about links between food addiction prevalence and BMI categories. And the reason we did this is not because I like to focus on weight, was because there's a lot of food addiction symptoms in people that are in the lowest weight category. Okay, so for example, people with anorexia nervosa. And what this all pointed to was that food addiction can actually be perceived by people that are dieting or engaging in eating disorder behavior. So one of the major conclusions of this recent work was that when we talk about food addiction, we also have to think about drivers of things that influence the perception of food addiction, such as restriction, et cetera. So questions, right? Is a food addiction diagnosis valuable in the treatment of eating disorders? And I would say that, like, in some cases, absolutely. In other cases, not. How do we know if food addiction is an actual addiction or just a symptom of dieting? Well, you got to investigate the dieting. You got to have clinicians who are unbiased, that are given tools or develop tools to use interview styles and really be able to understand this complicated symptom picture. Should food addiction better be called an eating addiction and viewed as behavioral rather than substance related? I would say no. The data supports substance related. However, recovery can be more behavioral than substance related. People can abstain from, eating in certain ways rather than focusing on individual foods. Although some people focus on individual foods, and I am not passing any judgment there. And if someone does meet criteria, how do we treat them nutritionally? And if you're interested in this topic, read that most recent paper. It is open access. The major thing I wanted to just share about food addiction really is that if you think about it not as an individual level problem, so much about people, and think about it more as a public health problem, it starts to shift the narrative. Okay, so for example, in this study, using the food addiction model to explain eating behavior and BMI actually reduced weight stigma. Okay, so one of the things that I'm starting to see is that when we truly understand neurobiology, it decreases stigma. And this is what we saw with substance use disorder. Once we understood the neurobiology of it, there was less of finger pointing and blaming. Okay, and we have other studies that have shown the same. Participants are less stigmatizing. So similar to drug and alcohol addiction, I say when we can go out with the personal responsibility, in with the neurobiology, we can help people feel a little bit more understood, build rapport, and be helpful to them. Weight stigma is a huge problem and a huge topic today. I think about it as a societal problem, okay? Oftentimes a form of stress, trauma, and adversity that keeps people in a vicious cycle, okay? We know that with stigmatization, it can increase, a lot of biomarkers, which can drive food consumption, can increase oxidative stress. And now there are very strong arguments in favor of adopting weight inclusive health policies. Just like I don't do calories, I don't do weights unless it's clinically appropriate. Okay. And I think that just removing all the numbers from nutrition is such a step in the right direction. and that's my own personal bias. When we look at things like trauma leading to food addiction, and by the way, there's a lot of papers on trauma and food addiction, okay? And I just wanted to really give you some references. This is a paper we wrote that reviewed some of those papers, okay? And when we think about, these drivers of biological embedding, we always want to put it into the larger context of society. So, living in a larger body. And I know obesity is not a favored term by some people. It's still a term that we use in academia, okay? But I just wanted to acknowledge, if anyone's uncomfortable with the word, I'm aware of paradigm shifts, okay? Weight stigma is a form of stress, trauma, and adversity, and also a driver of dieting behavior, okay? So the whole point here is that we have to think about broader contextual factors, stop thinking about individual people and start thinking about social context, all right? Dietary restraint is often defined as a cognitive effort to eat less in order to lose weight. We know that dieting can be very stressful. And one of the key points that I've been trying to make about food addiction is that the signal of food addiction can often be muddled by the noise of dietary restraint, okay? So if people are dieting a lot, they're more likely to have food addiction symptoms. So if you put this in the context of substance use disorder, you might have people that have had food-related dysfunction that led to their addiction with other substances. You might have had people that, cross-addicted into, exercise addiction and then got really into dieting. And then they were trying to pursue fitness or leanness and ended up, with binge eating and food addiction like symptoms. You can't just rely on assessment tools. You can't just rely on instruments to understand these things. You have to put it in context. And for any dietitians here, you can't just rely on one single food philosophy either. You have to bring in multiple modalities in order to really understand the larger symptom pictures, all right? We did a systematic review looking at the link between ACEs and BMI and found that there was a 46% increase in the odds of adult quote unquote obesity following exposure to multiple ACEs. Our recent work has focused on childhood sexual abuse and how that can become biologically embedded, essentially increasing risk for substance use disorders, eating disorders, and food addiction. So thinking about these clustering and co-occurring, and how a lot of those disorders are actually associated with efforts to suppress weight, either through drug use or through dieting, and how efforts to suppress weight are essentially a known risk factor for higher BMI over the lifespan. So one of the key points of this paper was to challenge this assumption that people exposed to childhood sexual abuse gained weight deliberately or subconsciously over time as a protective measure for future re-victimization. That theory I've heard so many times over the years, and we just took a deep dive into the literature and found that it's not very well supported, okay? It's just a theory. I'm not saying it's never true. I'm just saying that it's not always the case. And if you haven't noticed, like I said, I'm really into drawing diagrams to describe how literature points and tells stories. So a final sort of thought on food addiction is that a lot of it can be related to dietary restraint, but not all of it, okay? And dietary restraint is often driven by body dissatisfaction. So if we can start addressing body image and help people understand the role of their body in larger society in more meaningful ways, I think it's safe to assume that we can improve some of these symptoms as well. Okay, so what does it all mean? Let's go. I do make the argument that the eating disorders treatment community needs to get out of the box. Some of the training is outdated, lacks emphasis on physiology, like the stuff we talked about today, the gut-brain axis. There's a lot of stuff that's been done really well, like focusing on restrictive eating disorders. But what about the people that are not restrictive eaters? What about the people that don't diet? What about the people that have binge eating disorder, but have never actually gone on diets? Okay. We know that dieting is a risk factor for eating disorders, but my public health question that I want to pose is, where does all the dieting come from in the first place? Okay. It's not just from weight stigma. We have to start thinking about the role of these multinational food corporations that are certainly contributing to some of our health challenges. Big fan of intuitive eating, huge movement. I'm going to go ahead and call it a revolution, especially in the nutrition space. Assumes we can trust our body wisdom. And I would like to say if the gut has been stabilized, there isn't clear addiction symptoms, hormones become stabilized, and someone gets trained in some mindfulness, we can start to assume that intuition is available. However, if the gut is completely out of balance, there's a lot of inflammation, and this is what we see when there's a history of trauma. So this is where trauma-informed nutrition therapy comes in. If there's active addictions, hormonal extremes, you can't assume that someone will be able to access that. So it might take a little bit of time to move someone toward that. For some people, this is the goal. For other people, it might feel like they need more external sources of support. So yeah, happy to discuss my thoughts here. I think in summary, what I would say is that when there's significant trauma history, it's harder for people to intuitive eat. Yes? Okay. So we have to consider biology. A calorie is not a calorie. The food does matter. Educational efforts just to improve, drug addiction or food addiction are not sufficient. Okay. We need public health interventions. Of course, in these settings, we need to watch for eating disorder behaviors, things like skipping, dieting, lots of charge, leaving the meal right after eating, laxative teas, supplements, hiding food, playing with food, talking about food or body talk, right? Following a lot of fitness accounts on social media, and of course, orthorexia. One of the biggest things that I'm trying to pitch is hands-on nutrition. That's real. I mean, I could teach people and give you handouts and give you lectures all day long, but getting people in the kitchen as a part of treatment to develop life skills, go grocery shopping, meal planning, and then cleaning. A lot of people don't want to clean. It's time to learn how to clean. That's a big part of nutrition. The big picture goals are not weight focused. This is about harm reduction, disease reduction, focusing on overall health, the body, the mind, the spirit, behavior change, self-efficacy, helping people get restored to sanity, whatever that means for them, recovery, which is difficult to measure, and eventually helping people develop a relationship with food and exercise that's intuitive and personal. One of the parts of intuitive eating that I think is missing is that it can also include intuitively knowing which things to do less of. Okay. Always wanting to avoid the quick fix wherever possible. Couple final thoughts on food addiction, and then I'll start summarizing more broadly of this topic. Food addiction treatment doesn't always require food abstinence, specific substance abstinence. Sometimes behavioral abstinence works better, but it may warrant reduced exposure. Okay. Reduced exposure might be helpful, but most importantly, it does require recovery, which often includes psychosocial support. And the trauma has to be healed. We have to bring the body back in with things like meditation, breath work, yoga, all these different modalities that we use in addiction treatment can be helpful for people's relationship to food. And all of it points to this idea that brains can be wired. It doesn't happen slowly. It happens over months and years. Okay. As always, self-destructive black and white thinking should be challenged. The relentless pursuit of thinness needs to be challenged. If people are body dissatisfied and driven by weight loss, it's going to create dysfunction. Okay. And we can't necessarily say that that's a quote unquote food addiction. It might just be a relic of dieting. All right. So in the food addiction conversation though, and this is relevant for substance use disorder treatment centers, the food that we eat impacts our microbiome. Okay. Which in turn regulates homeostatic mechanisms and affects our mental health. So I'll stick my stick in the sand here and say, we do need to look beyond nutritional quantity, just thinking about things like exchanges, and we have to consider nutritional quality. And that is important. And for some reason seems to be controversial. Is that controversial? Intervention studies that incorporate education on food addiction could be dangerous if not done properly. So if someone isn't well-versed in eating disorders, messaging around food addiction could be harmful. All right. Food addiction research would benefit from more studies adjusting for dieting and dietary restraint. It might prove beneficial to identify some nuances within these definitions. And then, most importantly, thinking about the clustering and cross associations between food addictions, substance use disorders, and eating disorders, using a systems biology approach, thinking about multiple biological systems rather than focusing on individual mechanisms. And I think a hub here is the gut microbiome, and thinking about how we can be moving people toward reversibility of these biological embedding pathways. Other questions broadly about nutrition in this arena: can personalized approaches to anti-inflammatory eating improve mental health, right? So once we know more about the blood-brain barrier integrity, this idea of leaky brain, neuroinflammation, can we start using food to improve some of these outcomes? Can nutrition interventions stimulate or reverse epigenetic changes? There's some data that says yes. Are long-term dietary changes, such as abstaining from highly palatable foods, even feasible in our food context or food environment? Can dietary changes improve the microbiome in ways that impact reward? And this is a very, very interesting question, in my opinion. And can reducing exposure to addiction like eating improve executive functioning? So this handout was created 2 years ago in the California Department of Public Health, and I was very thrilled to see this land, and I've been sharing it widely. It's about trauma-informed nutrition, and I just wanted to highlight the key points before we start to summarize. Trauma and adversity can disrupt biology and exacerbate an unhealthy relationship to food. So I'm here at the bottom, leading to poor nutritional health. The relationship between food, individuals, families, and communities must be treated with compassion and a holistic perspective that acknowledges individual, historical, and systemic trauma. Okay, so we've talked about ACEs. Yes, household dysfunction, childhood maltreatment, expanded community level ACEs. And then it's also important to acknowledge that there's a whole domain of adverse food related experiences. So not just trauma that we think about in the traditional sense, but food insecurity, unpredictable meals, restriction, control, body shaming, a loss of food traditions, manipulation, punishment, rewarding with food, shame, bias, stigma when utilizing food assistance, untrustworthy or inadequate nutritional supports. And then we have these behaviors that result from this type of adversity and others: hoarding food, binge eating, compulsive overeating, high fat, high sugar, high salt diets, reliance on convenience foods, eating disorders, or food addiction. All right. California Public Health, Department of Public Health was able to unbiasedly look at the data the way I have. Okay. Decision making to meet short-term rather than long-term needs, and then deprioritization of planning and budgeting. So what can RDNs do using this trauma-informed approach? Acknowledge historic and systemic trauma, focus on holistic well-being rather than obesity and BMI. I just want to really highlight it's possible to do nutrition interventions that don't involve any numbers, that don't involve any weigh-ins, that don't involve any calories. And this is a revolution, okay? And I want to invite you to join us, to refrain from overemphasizing personal behavior change. You know, this idea of personal responsibility: if you want it bad enough, you'll do it. And if you don't, it's because you didn't want it bad enough. That sort of language, right? Very harmful. Recognizing that some nutrition interventions may be triggering. I think a lot of people have been traumatized by nutritionists, people that haven't had good insight into behavioral health, or maybe are extrapolating from their own experience. And so, yes, we need to bring in more healing energy, identify people's willingness to adopt new behaviors, acknowledge people's strengths and skills, inspire healing and a healthy relationship to food, reduce shame, anxiety, confusion, and tension, practice cultural humility, and always address our conscious and or unconscious biases. So I think that, you know, as we move toward integrating nutrition into substance use disorder treatment centers, we need to be eating disorder informed, and we need to be trauma informed. And that being said, we also need to think about the importance of nutrition for mental health. So hopefully I was able to cover all the things that I believe to be important. In the space of substance use disorder, there's a lot of unanswered research questions, like how quickly to increase fiber, antioxidant supplements, gut supplements, immune support supplements, what strains might be best, if we can use stool samples, magnesium as a supplement, genetic testing, amino acid therapies, co-occurring addiction, eating disorder, when to refer out, when to keep in. What do we do about food addiction? You know, like, do you leave it alone? Do you message about it? Is it a risk factor for dieting, et cetera? Best ways to address body image. I think if we can address body image and, get a weight neutral conversation going, it's huge in these settings. Best strategies to reduce night eating, concept of mindful eating, long-term nutrition therapy with consistent eating patterns. I'm a big fan of just regular eating patterns. I'm like, in the context of mental health, things like intermittent fasting are not helpful. Okay. There's an exception to every rule. There's someone that swears by it, but there's differences between short-term outcomes and long-term outcomes. People that are susceptible to extremes are going to be drawn toward more extremes. So in these settings, you're going to get people that want to do keto and do intermittent fasting and get really into exercise. And I think an important role of dietitians and other practitioners is to help move people toward more normalized and consistent eating patterns, because we know that can set up extremes later on. And a big part of nutrition for mental health is just learning how to say no to extremes. All right. What about medications? Medications in the gut. Best topics for group education, how to best implement cooking classes and life skill workshops, implementing the nutrition guidelines. We call this implementation science, right? How does, nicotine, smoking, vaping impact taste in relationship to food? How to reduce caffeine, how to incorporate exercise in the best way that doesn't end up being excessive for some people. And then finally, best ways to collect data and publish findings. So what can the RDN do? One of my career missions is that every patient who walks into substance use disorder treatment should be assessed by an RDN who can screen for eating disorders and other dysfunctional and disordered food behaviors, potentially look at labs for certain high-risk patients, run groups, offer one-on-one counseling, collect data, publish the findings, develop new curriculum, life skills, experiential therapies with special events like going to the supermarket, and really importantly, attend the treatment planning and staff meetings, right? Be integrated into the team rather than patched on, right? Working with medical and mental health professionals to help clients achieve treatment goals. And of course, other exercise related, nutrition related interventions to facilitate long-term sustainable behavior change. And then of course, auditing the menu, suggesting substitutions that are within the budget, thinking about the food service and food safety improvements, and then working with the team to improve the food environment. And I will say that, in my opinion, stigma is recovery's greatest enemy. And there's stigma around substance use disorders, addiction. There's stigma around weight, which is pervasive, and I'm going to say is the next social justice movement. There's stigma around eating disorders. And there's a lot of misunderstanding about eating disorders. Eating disorders aren't always just anorexia and bulimia. There's a whole continuum of disordered eating, some of which can include addiction-like eating. And that is definitely a part of the work that I've done. But I do want to state that all of it is designed to increase our understanding so that we can decrease stigma and reduce the barriers between the practitioners and the clients, develop trust, build rapport, help people feel safe, help people feel comfortable in the body that they live in so they can move into their next chapter with grace and feeling empowered. Oosh. All truth passes through 3 stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. And third, it is accepted as being self-evident. And that's what I got. And here I am once again. Please keep in touch. Please check out the new blog. Please follow on social media, and always feel free to give me any feedback.
Thank you, David, for that very comprehensive discussion. I was getting some messages from people asking if they will get the recording because they were trying to write fast and capture some notes and are looking forward to getting slides and the recording of this. So I'm going to take a quick look and see. I know there was a couple of questions that came through earlier. I see one question, if we're going to get started with that. Quickly on vegetarian option for bone broth, it was mentioned early on in one of your slides about different foods to include.
I am aware of vegetarian supplements that have some of that same sort of some of those same ingredients, you know, the collagen, glutamine. There are some supplements that are plant-based that mimic the positive benefits of bone broth. And I think there are some vegetarians that are comfortable with bone broth and others who are not.
Great, thank you. Does anybody else have any other questions? You can feel free to unmute. Just a yes, reminder, the slides, I will send a follow-up message. So I will send out the slides and the recording once that gets captioned and ready to go, along with some other helpful links and resources that complement today. So stay tuned and watch out for that message. Seeing a lot of thank yous. This is amazing information. I'll just pause to see if anybody else has any other questions to ask.
Someone's asking about cannabis and the microbiome. I have not done a deep dive in the literature there. It's a really good question. I think what we've learned is that everything has the potential to shift gut bacteria in some ways, but I'm not an expert in how cannabis does that, but we'll certainly explore that further. Thank you for the nudge. What do we think about fruits and vegetables in a capsule that's been promoted a lot on TV? Do you mean in a supplement form? I'm guessing you mean like the powders that are supplements. I mean, I want to be open to people's needs. And so I would say, like, if someone has true food aversions and they're completely unable to get past certain textures, that might be a good intervention. But I think with, the general population, I mean, it's just not the same thing as real food. And so I think a lot of people get this impression that if you take this, you'll be good, you'll be covered. And I think that's what they're promoting through the marketing efforts. And I'm not convinced. And, this is partially because of not just vitamins and minerals, but these polyphenols that are easily degraded in processing, right? So a lot of the things that are very beneficial in fruits and vegetables will not survive and end up in the pill form. You'll get some of the vitamins and minerals, but you won't get the stuff that the bacteria really thrive on. Okay, and that's my opinion. Those things can be helpful to people who don't have other options, but it's certainly not an improvement to fruits and vegetables. Someone's asking about probiotics and depression and anxiety. According to like the most recent systematic reviews, like half of the studies that investigated links between nutrition and mental health have shown positive effects for depressive symptoms. Anxiety was a little bit weaker of an effect size, but different studies have used different probiotics and used different clinical samples. So it's not at a point where we'd be able to say these are the strains. I mean, I think that there's some broad recommendations that can be made. I think everyone's gut is different. So sometimes a strain is helpful to someone because they're missing that strain. And other times a strain is helpful to someone because it might compete with some other strain that has a quote unquote negative effect. So I think I would say that we're still at the very broad recommendations stage. But to give you a little more context, a lot of depressive symptoms are being conceptualized less just about serotonin. And there are some definite arrows pointing to phenotypes of depression being rooted in inflammation, certainly bidirectional. So I'm not saying inflammation is the sole cause, but if we think about what we learned today about gut health and inflammation, if someone has a depressive phenotype that is inflammation based, focusing on gut health and using probiotics, et cetera, certainly can be one pathway toward reducing depressive symptoms. And I think that, things take time. You might not feel it in 2 days the way someone would on a medication, but there's promise here. And these things are being used and helping people, and can certainly be used in conjunction with other treatments. Okay. So Lisa's asking about specific info for pregnant women. When I spent some time at Janus in Santa Cruz, one of their houses was a perinatal house. And so, yes, I built some curriculum for that population. I have a collection of things, and I'd be happy to share it with you, Lisa. How about that?
Thank you.
Yeah, send me an email. Okay, slides are coming. I appreciate the positive feedback. Can we say more about artificial sweeteners? And thank you for the questions. The data on gut bacteria and artificial sweeteners is way more robust in the Splendas and the acyl sulfames, the classic 4 colors that have been around for a few decades now. Less robust in the more new ones like monk fruit. Okay. But the pattern has been that chronic exposure to artificial sweeteners, both in animals and human models, does reduce bacterial diversity. And it makes total sense. This is a similar pattern to certain medications. It makes total sense. If you think about it, you're eating something that doesn't occur in nature, and you're putting the task on the inner ecology. Okay. And so your inner ecology is going to be responsible for breaking down things that aren't recognized as quote unquote food. Okay. And so, from what I understand is that there's going to have to be a increase or a proliferation in species that are responsible for doing that. So if there's a drug that someone's taking every day, a psychotropic medication, you're going to have some species or strains growing because the gut is getting used to breaking down a specific compound every day. And similarly, if you're drinking 4 Diet Cokes per day, 5 Diet Cokes or the equivalent, you're going to get more bacteria that are responsible for breaking down the artificial sweetener. And in doing so, in those types of shifts, there is oftentimes going to be a loss of other beneficial species. So that being said, there is data to show the similar pattern in stevia, which is reductions in bacterial diversity. Okay. And I would go ahead and predict that this would be the case for all artificial sweeteners. Okay. Now, one of the best tactics of the food industry has been to convince people that these are not, in fact, artificial sweeteners, that these are natural. So you don't need to worry about them. Right. And I think that is just a perfect example of how, corporations put private profits ahead of public health, right? Yes, stevia is a plant, but the stevia that they're putting in, products does not all come from plants. Okay. Those are extracts and created in laboratory settings. And the same thing is true with monk fruit, I believe. The name is just genius, isn't it? It just sounds like not only a fruit, but like a monk, right? Like what could be better than that, right? And so the public is very quick to say, okay, they said it's okay, it's fine. I need something sweet. I have to have it. But I would make the argument that anything concentrated that doesn't occur has the potential to create some microbial shifts that are not advantageous. I would go ahead and also make the argument that one of the bigger problems with artificial sweeteners, and, you know, I know there's a need for these things. Okay. I've got a protein powder that's plain and unsweetened, but I also have one that has stevia. Like, it's impossible to avoid some of these things. Okay. But in general, my bigger bone to pick with artificial sweeteners is that it conditions the brain to expect food to taste a certain way. And it makes it more difficult for people to eat unsweetened food. Okay. So if someone's in early addiction recovery and they're doing, you know, Splendas in their coffees and protein powders and bars and things of that nature, you know, yes, being concerned about their gut health makes sense, but I would be more concerned about their capacity to eat unprocessed whole foods that are high in fiber, because it'll be more difficult for that person to enjoy that food because it's not as potent in terms of its taste and flavor profile. So that's my little bone to pick with artificial sweeteners. I do think that, you know, we got to be realistic, and sometimes there's a need for little sweets and treats. But if I were to look at artificial sweeteners from a very comprehensive picture, looking at its effects on gut bacteria and its effects on reward expectancy through food, and the fact that it offers no nutrients, you know, it would be the one thing that I would say our society would benefit greatly from removing. I think that, you know, it was sort of intended to, you know, help people with, you know, diabetic conditions, and it didn't. Okay. It doesn't help, in my opinion. Okay. Long term, it's not helpful. And it reeks of diet culture. It just reeks of diet culture. And I don't like that energy around. So that's my 2 cents on artificial sweeteners. Someone said we have many food deserts, you know, with gas stations. It's been challenging to help clients move to real food. Yeah. Yeah. And that's why, you know, we need to think about these as public health problems. I've worked with places that have a limited budget and they have one food supplier, and we're going to make some changes within that relationship. And the changes are minimal. You know, but, you know, I've also had experience where we've added other food providers. We've got people to become champions in the kitchen, gotten clients to get excited about eating differently, started a group, and people are starting to make their own foods and things. And the whole point of my paper from the Santa Cruz thing is that it can be done. This was a low income, publicly funded facility serving mostly people that were homeless prior to living there. Okay. And it can be done. You can absolutely make some changes in even the most challenging environments. And, you know, one of the problems with quote unquote real food, I'm probably going to stop using that term soon, is that, yeah, it requires more labor, more work. And you have to have people that know how to connect to it and cook it and prepare it and serve it in a way that feels meaningful. And we live in an era where convenience is king, and people just don't want to, people aren't used to doing that kind of effort when you could outsource it and have a company factory do it for you. So huge fan of connecting with food, taking people to the grocery store, getting them to heal any sort of disconnects that have occurred in kitchens, in grocery stores. I think that that's like the real spiritual work in this part of the picture that, you know, I think should not be overemphasized. Forget about nutrition guidelines for a minute. Forget about the specifics about gut bacteria or inflammation. What if it was just about bringing joy back into the kitchen, getting people excited to roast some vegetables or to make a protein dish? You know, like, it could really be that simple. And I believe in that and stand by it.
That was amazing. We're at 10:30 on the nose with that last question and response. So thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, David, for all of your wisdom and expertise and sharing in this area. Was really great to hear all of these perspectives and frameworks that you discussed today. I will be sharing again the slides. We will stop recording here shortly, and I will send that out along with some other resources. And with that, I think we are wrapped up for today. So I appreciate everybody joining, and we hope to hear what's on the next forefront, David, from you when you're ready to share more.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you.